Review copy provided by PlayStation. The implication of a remake comes with a high set of expectations, particularly these past few years with the Resident Evil and Final Fantasy VII remakes raising the bar by reinventing the core gameplay to be more accessible for modern players. So when rumors of The Last of Us Part 1 surfaced, only 9 years after the original release, many hoped that this remake would go beyond just improved visuals, perhaps with new story elements and bringing the gameplay up to the standards of Part 2. So does The Last of Us Part 1 change the game in any significant ways, or is it mostly the same experience with a new coat of paint? But first, let's discuss what hasn't changed, which is most of it, including the level design, voice acting, and story. Which means you're still getting the same award-winning adventure that was acclaimed for its game design, visual presentation, and emotional storytelling. The Last of Us is set 20 years after a fungal virus wiped out most of the world's population, turning them into hideous infected. And as a survivor named Joel, it's your job to escort an immune girl named Ellie across the United States, as she might be humanity's last hope. This game is a linear action-adventure title, where being smart with your resources is key to fighting the infected and other survivors. You'll craft bandages, explosives, and even upgrade your guns to make them more useful during combat, or you can temporarily put them aside in favor of some stealth tactics. The question now is if the remake of this tour de force was necessary. At first, the PS5 Remake definitely looked better and more realistic to my eyes, but not by much, as it still appeared just like The Last of Us that I remembered. But then I booted up the PS4 Remaster and realized, wow, the original game looked a lot better in my memory than it actually does these days. While the character model improvements are most noticeable, being more detailed and expressive like in Part 2, it's really the environments that stood out the most, as it's wild how much more detailed they are than before, making the original feel barren by comparison. Sometimes the phrase less is more rings true, but not here, where more is more, as every area feels grittier and messier, which is exactly what you'd expect in a post-apocalyptic world. As far as I can tell, every single model has been either remodeled or retextured, if not both. Signs are entirely remade, more foliage can be found in certain areas, and some objects have been replaced completely with something else. Like what used to be a metal cabinet is now a bookshelf, for example. It may not always be exciting per se, but your brain surely noticed. Speaking of shelves, I also saw that some smaller items on shelves can now be moved by aiming your gun at them and wiping them away. I'm not sure how intentional this was, but it's a nice touch. The overhauled visuals make this post-apocalyptic world feel even more lived in. I would imagine things would be pretty messy in a time like this, but also more beautiful as nature begins to take over. In addition, the lighting has been completely revamped in most areas, and it exposes how poorly some of them were lit by comparison. It doesn't make the scary areas, though, any less horrifying, like the subway filled with clickers, for example. Let me put it this way. I don't plan to go back to the PS4 version of The Last of Us. Both because the lighting is so much better in the remake without compromising the spooky atmosphere of some levels, and also because of how much more expressive the characters' faces are. I was never too fond of Joel's original character model, as I always thought he had a resting mad face half the time, which is understandable given his personality, but here he has a wider range of emotions that are much better displayed along with the other principal characters like Ellie, Bill, and Tess. These made the already emotional cutscenes even better, as you can more clearly see the pain in a person's eyes whenever tragedy struck or when they were holding back what they were feeling. I easily prefer these cutscenes to the originals because of how much better they convey the expressions of every character.
You keep babysitting long enough and eventually it's gonna blow up in
Bill,
your face.
Can we please just get on with it?
While we're on the subject of faces, the infected also look leagues ahead of their original versions, with highly disturbing faces and fungal spores on creatures like the clickers and bloaters. So even though the original Last of Us looked great for its time on PS3 and PS4, the PS5 Remaster blows them out of the water, making the game even more beautiful and immersive. I'd say it looks as good as the best looking PS5 game, and it doesn't have ray tracing. I never thought that the PS4 Remaster could look so outdated, but The Last of Us Part 1 accomplished this by remaking everything from scratch while keeping the level design intact. I will say though that it's odd I didn't notice just how big of a change the remake was until I went back to play the remaster. Kind of goes to show how people who haven't played the PS4 version in a while might not notice any huge differences right away. That isn't to say part 1 doesn't obviously look better, but even I was shocked at the little changes they made when I put the footage side by side, such as how Joel's backpack now reacts much more realistically when moving around. Chances are, newcomers to the series will see a greater value in the graphics of this remake than the veterans with an unreliable memory will. Players are able to run these visuals in 3 different ways with the performance options. Fidelity runs the game at 4K with a target of 30 FPS, but it looked choppy, and turning on motion blur to smooth it out made me sick, which is why I preferred to play in performance mode, which targeted 60 FPS with a dynamic 4K resolution. And I didn't notice any frame rate hiccups during my entire playthrough, and it looked and felt great. There's also a Performance Plus option which targets 120 FPS for 120Hz displays or VRR ones, but because I don't have a TV or monitor that does either, I wasn't able to test this mode out. There are other perks too, like how cutscenes are completely seamless now on account of being rendered in real time, unlike the PS3 and PS4 versions, which had a short black screen when transitioning between gameplay and the pre-rendered cutscenes. It's a nice little touch that blends the story and gameplay together more fluidly. There's even some extra animations added, like Joel closing a door after a cutscene ended. Furthermore, the game has been updated to more closely match The Last of Us Part 2 in some ways, such as the HUD elements. The health bar, quick menu, generator QTEs, listening mode, and aiming crosshairs are ripped directly from Part 2. You can also view collectible items in characters' hands like in Part 2, which is neat and more appealing to look at instead of viewing it through a dull black menu. However, the real treat here is the gunsmithing. While older versions of The Last of Us merely had you navigate a menu to upgrade your guns, the remake brings in the gunsmithing animations from Part 2, and it's so satisfying to watch Joel add a scope to a weapon, replace a grip, or increase the size of a magazine. Even when these animations don't make any sense, like Joel wiping a shotgun to increase its range, I don't care, it looks rad. There is another small change that was made at the end of the game to keep it consistent with Part 2, but I won't mention it here to avoid spoilers. If you want to know, check out our video on 17 changes made to The Last of Us Part 1. Visuals aside, nothing else about the presentation has changed. The audio, soundtrack, and voice recordings appear to be the exact same and haven't been re-recorded, which is fine given that they've aged the best out of everything else and fit perfectly as is. But there is some new content in the form of numerous extras you can unlock by cashing in the currency you earn simply by playing the game, including 6 hours of behind-the-scenes documentaries and podcasts. As cool as these special features are, you aren't able to rewind or fast-forward the videos, only pause them, unlike the podcasts which let you do all of that. This is a problem, as Grounded, the making of The Last of Us documentary, is an hour and a half long, and if for some reason you turn off your PS5 in the middle of it, you have to watch it from the very beginning instead of continuing where you left off. This might be a technical oversight, so hopefully it gets patched in the near future. Either way, you can watch this on YouTube and listen to the podcasts online, so it's not like you're getting any exclusive content here. There's also developer commentary that can be played during cutscenes, but these were also in the remastered version. The extras menu also includes a character model viewer, in-game skins featuring some PlayStation brands like Jak and Daxter in God of War, and most fun of all, gameplay modifiers like infinite ammo, infinite health, slow motion, and audio-video filters. My favorite ones turned The Last of Us into an 8-bit game.
Now, there we go. Yeah, it'll be faster to go through here.
Speaking of game modifiers, the same in-depth accessibility options from Part 2 are here, such as a high contrast mode, a descriptive audio tool, and numerous other features that players can utilize to fine-tune the game to their liking. For many people, The Last of Us Part 1 might just be the only way for them to experience this classic, and that is an absolute win. There's also the DualSense controller's rumble and haptic feedback features, which I've gotten used to at this point, so I didn't notice them too much, though they did offer some additional immersion to the weapons and actions in the game, with accurate rumbles whenever a gun was shot or a punch landed. To me, the marketing oversold just how impactful the DualSense features would be, namely emphasizing how realistic it felt playing with water guns in the Left Behind DLC. It just felt like normal rumbling. Strangely, some of the fun references to previous Naughty Dog games like Uncharted and Jak and Daxter have been oddly removed, like the board games in the toy store. Though thankfully the plushes in an apartment bedroom remain there, with an extra Nathan Drake doll to boot. And if you're a speedrunner, look no further than the speedrunning mode, which times your progress as you play and pauses during each cutscene. If that doesn't sound scary enough, permadeath mode from part 2 comes in as well. And boy, I do not want to even touch it. Imagine getting to the last level and dying. I would be mad for weeks. But what about the gameplay? At first, I didn't notice any major changes, which was kind of a bummer, especially since a lot of us were anticipating elements from The Last of Us Part 2 being added here, as it provided a lot more combat options compared to the first game, like going prone for stealthy kills, or getting knocked back by enemies and shooting them instantly from the ground. It's one of the few games where I felt like I was in 100% control of my character at all times. But after revisiting the remaster, I can confirm that the remake still includes a few changes. Guns have more of a kick to them, giving them massive recoil even when you upgrade them to reduce their kickback. I honestly don't understand why this change was made, as it neither improved the experience nor worsened it. But what is definitely better now is the bow, as you use it by pulling back and charging the shot with the right trigger like in Part 2. I was actually surprised that this wasn't in the remaster, as there you aimed with L2 and then pressed R2 to shoot the arrow. It's still effective, but I prefer the new way, as it better simulates how an actual bow works. Enemy AI has also reportedly been upgraded, but I barely even noticed. It doesn't help that I saw my AI companions sneak past enemies that were staring right at them, which also happened in the original game. Although it was pointed out to me that infected behaviors have changed, as the bloaters now use their charge attacks from Part 2, and regular infected can crawl now. This is another one of those smaller tweaks to the game that I wouldn't have picked up on had I not been told about them. And that's about the extent of the changes made in the combat system that I noticed, and while it may be slightly better than in the original game, it only feels like a slight upgrade. It still plays well, but it feels a little lacking and rigid compared to Part 2. And I can't help but think more of that game's features would have made the gameplay in Part 1 better. As polished as this remake is, I still encountered a few strange glitches. One where the world would disappear when I stood in a specific spot, another when a companion character started fidgeting, and I couldn't open a cabinet door in spite of an indicator telling me I could. I still lose sleep wondering what was in there. One time I tried simply opening a drawer, and then Ellie got in my way and I started floating in the air. While thankfully these were the only glitches I encountered, they still stood out in what was otherwise a polished game, and I don't remember seeing them in the original versions. As a product, The Last of Us Part 1 is tough to review. On the one hand, it's still The Last of Us, a game that I've played multiple times and still enjoy to this day, with the original on PS3 and PS4 versions holding up really well. The story is a brutal tale of love and loss, with impactful story beats that are still talked about to this day and arguably hit harder when taking into account the events of Part 2. As timeless as the story is, the gameplay has also aged well, even if Part 2 improved upon it. You'll engage in brawls against other survivors and sneak your way past a barrage of infected mushroom peoples, all the while being aided by traveling companions and an array of crafting tools. The remake also includes the similarly upgraded Left Behind DLC expansion, which is a short but sweet tale of Ellie and her friend Riley before she met Joel. It's definitely worth playing after beating the main game just to get to know Ellie better. Between those flashbacks are gameplay segments where you play as Ellie going through an abandoned mall during the events of the main game. This expansion was upgraded in the same way, with the graphical overhaul and seamless transitions between cutscenes and gameplay. The Last of Us is a great game, and the remake is no exception. I appreciated playing it again with the enhanced visuals. I loved those improvements, as they further immersed me in the world and gave the original game a facelift that only a remake could accomplish, while still delivering the same entertaining gameplay and emotional story. If you're looking to play The Last of Us for the first time, this is the best way to do it. In fact, this will be my primary way to play the game from now on. Although it's disappointing that it doesn't include the Factions multiplayer mode, which feels like a significant chunk for a $70 remake. As a game, The Last of Us Part 1 is great, but as a remake, it leaves some things to be desired. I and many others were hoping that the improved gameplay of Part 2 would be included to some extent, but it's almost exactly the same as it was in the original first game, with only some minor differences in the HUD and weapons. At least the gunsmithing from Part 2 is here, and it looks better than ever. I also have to commend Naughty Dog for including a great amount of accessibility options in this remake. If anything, this is the best thing to come out of The Last of Us Part 1, as now more people are able to experience this amazing title. So, if you want to play The Last of Us with some graphical improvements and minor changes to some mechanics, then definitely pick up this remake. However, if you were hoping to play the first Last of Us but with Part 2's amazing gameplay, you're going to be sorely disappointed. I'm still glad I got to play it, but I wouldn't have felt like I missed out if I waited until a sale a few months down the road. So as an experience, I loved the remake just as I did the original game, but as a $70 product, I only liked it, which means that combining these scores together means that I liked it a lot. And I really did. Though the game could have done more to earn that remake label, I still appreciated the improvements it made to the graphics and gameplay, even if the latter was minimal. Still, I'm not sure if I'd recommend The Last of Us Part 1 to people who've played the original numerous times already, as the changes aren't extensive enough to warrant a double or triple dip. But for first-time players, you got to pick up The Last of Us Part 1, as it is the best way to experience the game thanks to its visual upgrades and minor technical fixes. That said, even if you have played the original before, you should try this remake eventually, and it might wind up being your preferred way to play the game in the future. Thanks for watching this review of The Last of Us Part 1 here on GameXplain. Let us know in the comments if you plan on picking it up at launch or waiting until later. Be sure to check out the videos on the right too for more topics you might be interested in. Until next time, bye.